Okay, we're going to call the meeting to order since we're now late. Is there, Mayor Collier? I had on my lips, Collier is going to be here in about 10 minutes, and Regional Councillor Dyes is on her way or coming soon?
Should be midpoint.
Okay, good. So, is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest?
No.
Okay, great. We're going to open up the floor to Sheila.
Thank you.
Presentation is yours.
Good afternoon. I'd just like to ask some permission from the chair if I could. This is a fairly lengthy presentation, and I'd like the opportunity that we can be asking questions and having discussion as we run through it,
Sure.
given the length of it.
As long as you're okay with that?
I am perfectly good with that.
Okay, I'll keep it on the list.
Thank you. So this is really the first time that we have done this type of presentation on capital budget and the long-range capital forecast. We have a number of new councillors, which I think this is helpful for, and as well as some of the public residents as well. So we're going to go through, this is the agenda. As I've said, it's a fairly long presentation. The first sections from 1 to 7 cover kind of the budget, the process, all the pieces that we go through to get to a complete and finished product. From sections 8 to 10, those are more about the pressures, which we talked a little bit about on Monday, and what to expect for the public meeting that will be forthcoming for the capital budget on February 3rd. So budget and forecast overview. So this is a piece that you'll see in various literature that we produce for budget, and it indicates all the forecasts and the budgets that we do and how they interact together. So obviously we've highlighted that capital and the long-range capital forecast is what we're talking about today. We are going to have a similar session to this for the operating as well, but you can see how they all interact together and they feed into each other. So, definition. What is a capital budget? So the capital budget does all the funding for the design and the acquisition and maintenance of new and existing capital infrastructure. It can also cover some other projects such as master plans, studies, and strategies. So we're talking about new roads, new parks, we're talking about the maintenance of them, the replacement of them as well. So council actually approves the current year capital budget. So when we get to the budget meeting, it will be the 2019 capital budget. We also do a forecast for the following 4 years. Each year, although you approve it, each year we do update it when we go into the next year's process. So everything you see in the long-range capital forecast could have shifts and change relative to new information or different priorities. When I started at the town, my job was capital budget, and we did not have a funded capital budget. We would just put in numbers, there was no funding to it, and cross our fingers, and some of them would get done and some of them wouldn't. It has evolved to a fully funded capital budget, and we'll be talking about how we fund it. And then we do use a combination of what we have on hand as well as forecasted revenues to fund the budget. And we get now to talk about funding. Now, it's kind of interesting when you start doing this project and going through and making this presentation on the number of things that I have to tell you. So please, if there's any questions, just interrupt and we'll be happy to talk about it. So you'll have heard a lot about the financial sustainability plan. This was a plan that was implemented in 2014. It probably took us about 12 to 18 months to get it through the number of reiterations. We brought it to council a number of times, and it is an overarching guide for the strategic planning and looking forward into ensure that we have some long-term financial strength. And frankly, it also gives us some parameters on how we're working with our reserves throughout the year. So relative to the capital plan itself, the FSP, which we fondly call it, is defines and tells us about capital reserves as well as the long-term debt management. Debt, of course, being a source of funding in the capital plan.
And is that reviewed every 4 years, every year?
The financial sustainability, it gets updated. It really needs a big update. Right now, the reason it hasn't been fully updated is because of so many uncertainties. So particularly the slots, because it deals with the slots a lot. We do updates here and there. I suspect we're going to have one coming in 19 that'll be smaller ones. But before the end of this term of council, I suspect that there'll be a fairly large one coming back, particularly with asset management. Because we're waiting for that to be able to use the FSP to fund the asset management. So they're going to guide together. But we'll do some small ones in between.
And how long-term is long-term debt management? Is it like over the life of whatever the asset is, or is it 50 years, 100 years?
Well, typically, we'll talk about debt when we go in here.
Sure.
When usually we have a term of 15 years. It can be different depending on the type that we're issuing. We do internal and external debt, so we will do a different term. But we rarely, I can't remember a time, gone beyond 15 years.
Great.
But it is an option. So the discretionary capital reserves, it's actually governed under a policy, so there's 5 policies under FSP, and this is one of them. And it establishes reserves, what they are, how they get their money, how they're funded, and how we are able to use it. So for capital reserves, we actually have 11, 7 which actively fund the capital budget and long-range capital forecast. So let's talk about the inactive ones. So on these ones, we have capital contingency reserve. I'm going to save that one for a little bit because we're going to talk about that later in this. But it is, it actually was brilliant. I'd like to take credit for it, but because it is brilliant. It allowed us the flexibility when grant opportunities came to be able to fund the town share, instead of looking for money from other projects or going deeper into reserves than we had to.
Is there money in there now?
We'll get to
Being
that.
that
There
is-
is some, the target's 2.5 million, but we've really used a lot of it this year. We've used, I'll wait to
Okay,
get to the
yeah,
numbers,
that's fine.
but we've used a substantial amount to it. Unfortunately, the operating budget surplus isn't expected to be able to fully fund it this year, but it'll be on a continuous basis that we'll keep trying to bring that back up. I will say that typically grants come in cycles. So we've had a lot of grants the last 2 years, so we probably won't see as many opportunities in the next few years, and we'll be able to replenish it. The CIP, this is a part of our program for the downtown. The debt repayment reserve, this one is really not used right now. We use it to fund development charges, to be able to pay debt in the operating budget. And the post-growth reserve is something that was established knowing that we were going to have, subsequent to build out, we were going to have a higher demand for maintenance. So this is going to be one of the pieces that we use with asset management. Go ahead.
Sorry, through the chair.
No.
I was going to ask, in regards to development charges, I always thought that those were specifically used per house on a street, so that would pay for the curb and the sidewalks and the sewers. But you're saying that we're using development charges to pay debt because there's so many development?
No, we use development, part of development charges is that you can put debt in on new infrastructure. So for instance, when we build ARC,
Right.
and we issue debt on it, we can count that debt as new growth and collect development charges in part to pay for that debt. Because it's new growth, development charges are all about new growth.
Right.
So part of your funding of new growth is debt, you can use to set development charges to pay for them. We don't use it a lot.
But development charges specifically come from new property, new homes, new
Yes.
businesses,
Yes.
that the developer would pay to the town.
That's right, they come on the
So if
building
you
for
have
building issuance.
A pot of money called development charges.
Yeah, and it's all
$2 million
legislated.
in it.
Yep,
We don't use those necessarily for infrastructure. We
It-
can also use those those funds for debt repayment.
we use it for all growth infrastructure, which can include debt on growth infrastructure. You
Okay.
can have debt on growth infrastructure.
Okay, I might circle back around with
Yep.
you on this
That's fine,
later.
yep.
Just to clarify, maybe, Rob, with respect to your reference to paying for roads and curbs and sidewalks,
Right.
those types of things, those are development costs that are paid by the developer in conjunction with their subdivision. So they pay for that, right? They pay for all.
Over and
the
above
And
development
they pay
charges.
development charges on top of that. The
Okay.
development charges that would apply as it relates to roads would be more along your major infrastructure. So if as a result of that growth, you needed to widen Roslyn Road, or we needed to build a bridge across Carruthers Creek. So the larger town-wide infrastructure where there's generally a benefit to existing residents as well,
Yeah.
or what development charges would be used for.
That clears up my question.
But all the local roads are developer paid at the time and in conjunction with their.
And they also pay development
And
charges.
they pay development.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so the active reserves, most of these reserves get a combination of funding from the slots revenue, the general levy budget allocation, and the Viridian revenue. They all have specific uses. In particular, building maintenance also has funding from the portion of tax room from retired debt. So that's where debt payment is being paid at the tax base. It ends. That room will be moved to building maintenance because typically the debt is on facilities. So then we use that room to then fund the maintenance of the buildings moving forward. Debt reduction is the only reserve that's only gets funding from slots revenue. And that is, well, we can talk a lot about debt reduction. Debt reduction has done a number of things, and we'll talk more about it when we do the operating budget information session. But a lot is used in place of debt. So if, for instance, we would have had to issue $20 million of debt, we may be able to take $5 million to reduce the amount of debt issued. I think right now we've used about 20 million of debt reduction to reduce debt overall in the town since we started with the casino, which is a substantial amount. I think the other ones are fairly self-explanatory. On this slide, these are the balance of them, so these are the last three. For the vehicle and equipment, the added funding source on this one is sale of used and surplus vehicles and equipment. So if we get a trade-in for it, or if we do a straight-up sale on it, the money that's received for that will come back in to help replace further purchases of equipment. So I'll just tell you a little something about what happens when we do budget. We have a little activity that we do. We typically find an error after publishing budget, and it's usually something like we put or instead of and, or something small like that. We call it finding a Waldo. So there's a Waldo on this page, just so you know. The vehicle and equipment replacement are actually 15% of slots and 25% of Viridian revenues. We'll have that corrected for the posted version.
Sorry, 15 and 25?
Yes. So reserves get their contributions from the three sources, the general levy, the Viridian, and the slots. The 2019 budget number is just almost $16 million. And we're going to go through each one of those revenue sources as we go. So on the general levy allocations, you'll often hear Mayor Collier talk about this one. So this is where we're using the tax-based money to fund into the reserves. So part of the principle, of course, is that as our infrastructure is growing, we have more to look after. Some of those taxes that we're collecting need to move into this reserve and increase it. So in 2019, the increase from the 2018 budget is $92,000. I'll tell you that's not much. The reason it's low is because of the assessment growth is getting lower, and it's a percentage of that. And we can take up to 20%, but we only took 15% because we knew we were going to have a tax rate problem on the operating budget side. Any of this increase is only allocated to the four reserves that are highlighted on the screen there. So those other reserves have not changed their funding contribution since 2014. So the election reserve gets the exact same amount that it's gotten since 2014, and we haven't changed it since then.
Sorry, you mentioned 92,000 is a
Yep.
typically low number. What has it been on average previously?
That's a good question because it's hard to say because we have the slots. If we didn't have the slots, the typical methodology is to use a 1% tax rate increase to fund capital. So that, in our case, for 2019 would be about $630,000 a year. Most our municipalities, surrounding municipalities use that. We haven't used that because we have the slots.
Good thing we got those.
Yeah, no
Yeah. So Viridian budget, Viridian revenues, 100% go to the reserves. And again, this is part of the strategy of having non-tax revenues going to reserves, but also protecting the operating budget for changes in them. It can be hard to control, slots is a good example, substantial changes in them. So when they're going to reserves rather than to the operating budget, we're protecting the taxpayer from sudden large tax increases. So slots, you'll see, are very similar. They have a little bit more reserves that they are funding. There is a small amount of slots revenue that does go to operating budget, and it covers three things in particular. It covers Impact Ajax, funding for Durham Community Foundation, as well as the hospital. All of those, which we'll cover in our operating budget information session as well. So this is just kind of a visual that you can see. So this is each of the reserves and the amount of money from each of the revenue sources for the reserves. And, you know, kind of going from the smallest contributions to the highest. I think that these were developed and haven't changed since 2014. I do think that will be one thing that will definitely change when we get the asset management, is there'll be a different allocation between them. Long-term debt. So we actually created a full policy for the issuance and the guidelines for long-term debt. The policy covers the purpose, term, the maximum amount, the type, and as we talked about, the use of the tax room food and retired debt. So the way the policy is written, it is used exclusively for buildings, either the construction or expansion or major repurposing. Typically, we use a 15-year term, but we could do different terms depending on the type of debt or the impact on the operating budget and so forth. We do use both internal and external debt, and we kind of look at each case as we go. I'll give you a good example of internal debt. So when we finished the Ops Center, there was just about, I think it was about $2.5 million to be issued by the venture. So we issued that internally. And what that means is that the payments actually come back through the town. So we're paying debt on the building, which is appropriate, but the payments are coming back to the town. Yep.
So expansion or major repurposing, that would be an example of that would be the, I don't want to say it wrong, the place on Church, on Highway 2 in the
Quaker?
village. Yeah, the Quaker, that's a major repurposing, or is it not? Can you give me an example of?
Okay, I'll give you an example. When we expanded ice pads 3 and 4 in the ACC.
Okay,
That would
yeah.
be one.
That's a major repurposing?
That would be a major expansion.
Major.
Oh, you want a major repurposing might be the village at some point.
Okay, so the Quaker House is not considered to be a repurposing? Major?
Well,
Minor?
we didn't issue any
Federal?
debt on that one. We used all debt
Okay.
reduction reserve for it.
Okay.
We have no intention of issuing debt on that one
Yeah,
in particular.
okay.
We will fully fund that one.
Okay, thank you.
So I talked about the internal and the external debt, and also the tax room. So if we don't retire the tax room to building maintenance, we can retire it to the debt repayment to help on future debt that's issued. So, you know, just so to remind you, we talked about the strategies on Monday about using reserves to pay for debt payments. that means there's no tax room at a later date. So this strategy is not available when we do it, when we fund it from a reserve. The next section is reserve funds. So reserve funds are obligatory, they're statutory. They have all sorts of rules surrounding them on how you use them, how you can collect them, how you charge them, and so forth. So they can be through legislation or they can be through agreements. So development charges, we've talked about briefly already. The development charges, in accordance with the legislation, gets updated every 5 years. And it looks at the amount of infrastructure that is required for the growth. It looks at the population, how that's going to grow, and how new development will affect municipal services. It does all the calculations to come to a charge on a per unit basis or per square foot for non-residential. So when we go through a background study, it usually takes about a year. We do stakeholder consultations. That includes public, that includes developers. We usually have a list to invite. So we keep the community involved when we're doing it. The categories that are used for development charges include the transportation services, fire, parks and recreation, library, and administration. Administration often covers some of those forward plans that we do, our master plans, so planning to look forward. Transportation includes even active transportation. That was a change that we actually did. So it includes everything like bike lanes and multi-use trails and so forth. Parks and Recs includes both indoor and outdoor recreation services. So this is the most recent development charge that came into effect on July the 16th. And that is on a per unit basis for the residential, and the non-residential is on a per square foot. When we collect those, the amount is each allocated to those categories that we just talked about. So development charges are collected at the time of building permit issuance. And as we work through our capital budget, we do forecasts for the collections of it. We do that looking at planning applications, and we also will reach out to developers and look at what type of permits they're expecting to pull in the upcoming years. The use of development charges. So every project that's eligible to development charges has a portion that has to be funded by the reserve of the tax base. And it could run from 5% to actually quite a substantial number, could probably run to 30 or 40%, because depending how much will benefit the existing or how much is just not eligible. If we don't have the sufficient development charges, we have to defer the project. We run on the basis of not overdrawing development charges. We don't count on revenues we haven't collected. So we will monitor constantly the use of development charges to make sure that we're not overdrawing. Now, we do know that the development charges are going to be taxed rather heavily over the next few years, and I'll talk about a few strategies we have when we get to the pressures.
So is that just for Ajax, or do all municipalities think that way?
I haven't followed all the other ones. I think development charge is structured that it's structured that it gets harder to collect the farther you move out. So we're getting close to build out, so there's less development, but there's still a lot of big projects, like particularly widening, that happen late. So you get higher development charges for less of the development. So it's a kind of a badly written legislation, frankly. I think that everybody has challenges with development charges. I think we're probably a little bit earlier than others, only because we're getting closer to build out. But I also think that everybody has different requirements, so it depends on what kind of development they have, and what infrastructure that they have to build. So they're not always necessarily comparable.
Right. Thank you.
Federal gas tax. Now, federal gas tax is a good news story. Federal gas tax has been in place since 2005, and I actually went back and I looked, and in the first year of federal gas tax, we received $719,000. In 19, we're going to receive 3.6 million. So it is increased at a fairly good rate. It has been sustainable, and it's done a lot of work for us, and I'll go through a few of the projects that we've done with federal gas tax. The AMO, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, administers the federal gas tax program. They run municipal agreements with each of the municipalities. Our current one came into effect in 2014. They look after the distribution of the municipalities. They also ensure reporting on it. I would suggest that reporting has got to a point where it's probably, we're kind of looking at the guidelines for reporting. It's now something like 60 pages long, and I think it used to be 3 when we first started. So the level of reporting, it can be good, but it's quite rigorous, and it takes a lot of time and effort by the project managers involved with the various projects that we use this for. We do an annual report to council on our federal gas tax expenditures, and it is always posted on the website each year. The support that we get from federal gas tax are allocated into these areas. They have like a list of about a page long of different ways that you can use gas tax. We have isolated it to these areas, so community energy systems, local roads. We use it for the town portion, so when I talked about the DCs having a portion that has to be paid by reserves or the tax base, we'll use federal gas tax. We use it for new facilities in our sports fields. And new that they added was using it to advance the asset management practices and the planning that's associated with it, which was a good idea.
And what is a community energy system?
Sorry?
What is a community energy system?
So it could be anything like, Catherine, you can help me out here. There's so many things that we do with these ones.
Yeah, community energy systems would fall under if we're doing meters within our facilities. So we
I
want to
understand, yeah.
separately meter everything to understand what the cost of lights are versus the cost of water.
Okay.
That would be under that capacity.
Perfect, thank you.
It could be something like lighting in the facility. It could be new boilers, that type of thing as well, high efficiency.
Through the chair, am I supposed to say that? I see sports fields in regards to gas tax.
Yeah.
Would that fall under the umbrella of when I mentioned we wanted to minimize or compete with neighboring municipalities in regards to the sports fees for our baseball, skating, or is that a different?
No, so this is used for the infrastructure. So for
Gotcha.
sports fields, for instance, we could use it to put in LED lighting.
Okay.
Like we did at ARC.
So there's no correlation between sports fees?
It has nothing to do with sports.
Okay.
This is all about funding to build infrastructure.
Gotcha, thank you.
And then this has requirements for inputs and outputs and environmental contributions.
Thank you.
Okay, so bike lanes have always been funded through federal gas tax, right? But now we're moving them into DC?
We have actually moved those and some,
Yeah, we moved some of them to be funded from DC, I think strategic initiative, and some are in roads and maintenance, I believe.
and the reason is because you have to, they made another rule they changed the rules sometimes on federal gas tax reporting, and you have to be able to capitalize an asset. If there's not enough spent on the bike lane, we don't capitalize it under our policies, so we had to shift some of that funding into our reserves. In our DCs, we can get it from too when it's part of a bigger project and it's part of a whole road system.
Okay, that was a different language, so I'll have to talk to you later about that.
You want me to try again?
Any of that.
You want me to try again?
What?
Okay,
So,
so
okay,
they were no longer eligible, bike lanes,
Okay.
became ineligible to be funded from federal gas tax. So
Because we
have-
didn't have enough?
Because the price of them, how much it costs us, is not a capitalized asset. So, and federal gas tax has to be a capitalized asset. Okay, which is usually, I think it's about 25,000 or more. And a lot of the bike lanes can be just simple painting.
Much
It
less.
doesn't have an asset.
Okay,
Right?
okay.
So that's why. So then we use other sources of funding, such as DCs or the reserves. Is that
Okay.
better?
I think so.
Okay.
How about you guys?
Make sense?
I know,
It's
so
a
we've always said.
It was
it's
a
not
really good
that-
observation that we've made that shift.
Yeah. Well, it's because I've always said it's from the federal gas tax.
Yes.
That's been our saving grace.
Okay.
So some of the uses of federal gas tax, so the LED streetlight conversion that has been underway for, I think, 2 years now, continues. LEED certification, so the most recent we're working on is the Audley Rec Center and has been used for other facilities as well. Local road resurfacing, we're able to do, we are able to about double the work we do every year on local road resurfacing because of federal gas tax, which is great. And then various lighting retrofits that you'll see at the arenas and in some of the buildings. And again, saving energy in the long run and being more environmentally astute using that type of technology. The Parkland Reserve Fund, we don't actually use this as an active funding source right now through the 5-year plan. We have no particular projects that we would use it for now. It's really is collected through planning applications. In the very simplest form, we collect money where parkland requirements are less than required in the development. And then where we have developments that over-dedicate the parkland, we will compensate them for that. So it's kind of a balancing of the parklands throughout the different developments throughout the town. Did I get that kind of right, Dave? Yeah. Okay. And the uses are restricted in accordance to, the idea is to balance out the parklands throughout the town. Other types of funding, so stormwater maintenance reserve. So this is a reserve that has no sustainable funding source. We had a brief discussion about this on Monday. Come 2020, we will have pretty much used up everything that's in that reserve, and we will have to switch a funding source for any stormwater unless we are able to bring forward or council wishes to consider a stormwater maintenance fee, which will come forward in another report and will be looked at through a review of the fees for the town as well in 2019. We also have a building approval reserve. So when this got created by legislation, it was, they said in the legislation you can have a reserve or a reserve fund. It really acts like a reserve fund in that it has legislative restrictions. We just created a reserve, but it's truly a reserve fund. We can only use it related to building approvals items like the update of their modeling of their permit prices or costs and vehicles that building inspection may use.
How many roughly stormwaters ponds do we have right now? I think I've asked, we've been
I
doing
think
that
it's just
before.
over 50.
Yeah, we have,
Right.
there is in excess of 50 ponds
Yeah.
that the town's responsible to maintain. Most of them are, or a lot of them were built in the late 80s through the 90s and early 2000s, so they typically require maintenance on a 15 to 20 year period. So
15 to 20 years?
yeah,
Each of them?
in terms of the sediment cleanout, and that is part of the challenge is that
Yeah.
a lot of our ponds and the infrastructure is reaching that age, and we do not have a sustainable funding source to maintain that
Yeah, because
infrastructure.
boom, they're all going to be done at once,
So,
right?
Which speaks to staff's thought process of bringing to council consideration for a stormwater utility fee, which many municipalities are considering because across the GTA, the province of Ontario, they're dealing with the infrastructure at the same time, and they're now facing the same challenges.
So, why would we, maybe this is too simplistic, why would we have not created a reserve fund at the beginning of putting these stormwater ponds into existence? was it not, did you say it wasn't allowed, or what'd you say? No? Like, at some point, we were gonna have to fix them, right? And it seems to me that it's more common to have these ponds in new developments for water runoff and whatever, right?
So, to answer your question, back in the early 90s, the town did actually establish a reserve for stormwater maintenance purposes. And there was a calculation, $600 per net hectare, that was collected. It was a one-time payment, however, by the developer. So based on their contributable drainage area within a particular subdivision, they paid a dollar value that went into a stormwater maintenance reserve fund. So for 20 years, we were collecting money for the maintenance. We've been incurring maintenance costs, and we basically, and what Sheila's referencing is, we almost depleted that
So
reserve
if
fund.
that-
There's no replenishment of it, so
Right.
because it was just a one-time payment based
Yeah.
on their area. So now we're into ongoing maintenance. So it deals with the initial sort of one-time maintenance, but we're getting beyond that, so we need a more sustainable source.
So the maintenance part of it is the cleaning it out, like draining it, like, what do you call it, dredging it? No, what do you call it? It's something you
You can
call
say
it.
dredging
What
the
do you call it?
pond.
What? Cleaning
You
it.
can say dredging the
Cleaning it
pond,
out.
but it's basically, it's a sediment cleanup.
Yeah, and then because it loses its effectiveness, obviously. The maintenance around the ponds, is that covered just under operations, or?
If you're dealing with the vegetation, that's a maintenance operation.
Okay.
That's not what we're talking about in
No,
terms of
yeah,
stormwater
no, yeah.
management.
Okay,
So
thank you.
would you have an idea, like, could you say what a fee, what you would estimate a fee to be?
Each municipality is a bit different in terms of how they want to apply a fee. Like, some municipalities have done it whereby it's a standard sort of calculation across the board. Some who are more progressive will look at each individual property. So it gives incentive to individual property owners to, for example, decrease the amount of permeable surface, increase the amount of permeable surface on the
Right.
property to reduce the stormwater impact. So there's some control to receive some benefit in terms of the fee that they would incur. Whereas some others, it's just a flat fee per residential dwelling. So there are a number of different approaches. It really depends on the methodology of the municipality.
And we don't know what that methodology
We
is
would
yet.
need to go through a process and it would be a public process that
Right.
we need to go through to identify what an appropriate fee would be. And it would be tailored to Ajax. And I think that's part of the discussions we're having with the region right now, because the region's trying to coordinate and institute a fee at a regional level. But it's difficult when each of the lower tier
Right.
municipalities has their own different methodology and service approach in terms of how they would like to deal with it. And their infrastructure needs are a little bit different. So that's where some of the challenges have come in terms of getting all the lower tiers to align with the methodology.
And sorry, flip side to that question then, what is our annual maintenance fee for these stormwater things now, approximately? And I know this isn't a stormwater presentation.
Each stormwater pond will range generally between $200,000 and $400,000.
Times 50.
Yes.
Got it.
Now, you gotta remember, that's, when you look at it from an asset management perspective, we would like to get it so that you're in like what is a level
You're
of
on the
service,
cycle.
right?
Mhm.
So the asset management plan will establish a level of service. So if we're saying that the maintenance is, we're gonna put our ponds on a 20-year cycle, then that's 2 ponds a year, right? If you use 20 years. So it's coming up, and that's part of the asset management plan and the level of service that we were looking for council to endorse that would then feed into the financial planning that we would need to do.
Could you say that again? Stormwater spending between 300 and 400,000?
200 and 400.
204,000.
To clean out a pond.
For,
To
Clean it
a
out.
pond.
Dredge the pond.
but not, when you said times 50, there's not 50 ponds.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So we're spending $15 million a year?
Not every year. It's, you do,
So he's saying
you
over
do,
20
you do
years.
a couple every year.
Like road.
But they're coming up around the
Got it.
same time right now, which is what the.
When they were put in, we didn't forecast having to clean them out 20 years later.
Okay.
Now we have to figure it out.
It is, but we
guys.
used it up.
Actually, this is a very common problem amongst municipalities. It's a huge cost, and one of the things that, the main reason why we need to really address this is because if we don't do preventative maintenance on the ponds,
Yeah.
the cost to replace them is in the millions of dollars, So we really need to address this, and that's why there's a lot of discussion going on in Durham Region right now. The question is, how does the fee get charged? Where does it go?
So, not to belabor this, but I don't know if I heard, did you say that other municipalities in Durham have done this already, or they haven't done it, and we're all kind of in the same boat?
Not in Durham region. I think we're all sort of at the same stage, so
Okay.
we're all there. But I think there's 8 municipalities in Ontario, including Kitchener, Markham, Mississauga, that have already instituted these fees.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very few.
That was a year when you said 50.
Okay, and the final source of possible funding for capital projects are external sources. So we could have a case where we're teaming up with the region on something, or TRCA. Developers will sometimes be part of our contributing factors. Grants, where we're grants. Just to mention on the stormwater, we did get over $1 million of grants last year. So that has actually, even though we can't support projects after 2021, it's expanded that to 2021. We would have been in worse shape earlier than that if it weren't for that $1 million. So grants will be the other place where we'll get funding for capital. So production. So this is, we've talked about how we look at particularly all the funding, and now there is, how does it go from, we have our funding, I can't think of the word right now, structure, and then we move it into actually producing a capital plan every single year. So the key dates run through most of the year. We always joke that budget never stops. It just goes on and on and on. In June of every year, we do capital pre-submissions meetings, and that is where we look at, from the long-range capital forecast, was there new projects that need to be added? Are there any substantial changes either in scope or cost of the existing projects? In September, the senior management team will review the results of all the capital pre-submission and the council list. We'll talk about the council list a little bit in a little bit later. That's not something you're familiar with yet because we don't do it in an election year, but we'll be doing it in 19. Then in November, we do a final review of the capital funding and the cash flow. So we work to balance the projects and all the identified funding needed, and work to keep to spending caps, and you'll learn all about that in a second, and ensure that our reserves stay strong and healthy. We don't overspend our reserve funds as well. Then come December, we have the public budget meeting, and council will approve and ratify it. Of course, this year it's in February, because in an election year, we can't really have you on your very first meeting approve a capital budget.
Yeah.
So this is kind of what I was just talking about, how the process cycles around. It's interesting is the amount of engagement that does happen, and some of it is formal and some of it is informal. So, we have public information sessions all year on different, maybe development plans coming forward, or different master plans that people are putting out to the public. An example might be our development charges study, where we went out and talked about the different infrastructures and the costs associated with them, which in turn end up feeding into the capital budget. We do the budget survey every year. And last year, you'll recall, we had a budget open house and gathering feedback there. We look to development agreements and site plans of any obligations that are sitting within there that need to be funded through the capital. The strategic plan, any master plans, all will feed into, as best as we can fund. We typically don't get everything they want into our capital budget, but we definitely try to, prioritize the ones that need to get in as soon as possible. Of course, this will also be driven by inspections that happen throughout the year on all our infrastructure that needs to be repaired and maintained. And the other piece here is the council list. So the council list typically is something where council has identified operating or capital items that they want staff to look at. So what they do is that they, and we'll be reminding you through the next budget cycle on this, They'll provide directors with their input of something that maybe they want to see that's not in the budget, or that they've heard about from the taxpayers. And the director will have a look and investigate it and see where it fits in. Maybe we already have it in the budget and it's just not obvious. It could be something that we're already looking at. It could be something that's not our control, so we'll talk to the region about it. So we'll have these conversations and we'll formalize that list, through the budget process. So usually by August, we have finalized items from all council, and then we will work on that and make sure that it's complete and where it needs to be for November. Because in November, we start working on our forecast. So that is the formal way that council can inform the budget. But I would suggest to you that council regularly informs the budget every day when we have conversations, which is a good thing.
So that, you're talking about like the roundtable list.
This is in year. We do this every single year. So we'll like from like the strategic plan, your roundtable is going to lead to the strategic plan.
Yeah.
The strategic plan will in turn will inform budget as well. But these might be something in year. So this may be something that, like a pedestrian crossing, for instance, or a bike lane, or some traffic calming, any of those things, and that you have concerns with from your taxpayers. You talk to the director. Maybe we already have it in the budget, and maybe we need to look at timing. So those are just those constant conversations. There are some that become bigger than others, and some, if we already have it in the budget, we would leave it, but if there's something new, we'll put it onto the council list, and we'll have consideration on those ones, and work with councillors to include them wherever they fit. So capital pre-submission meeting, so this is, probably in around, well, some earlier than others, probably, March, April. Departments are looking at last year's long-range capital forecast. They're looking at any projects need to have timing changes. They have to be scope and costing revisions, or if there's something new that, that they've learned about since the last budget was passed that needs to be added. The things that we look at when we're looking at new projects particularly is what's the priority and where do they fall? Do they fall in the next year, or are they a 4-year out? We'll look at inspections, safety concerns, and of course engagement feedback that council will have received and will have received as well. There could be also changes in the municipal environment. We might want to look at marrying up one of our projects with the region project. So if the region's doing a water main in a given year, we're certainly not going to resurface that road the year before. So we'll marry those together, so there may be a shift because of that. We could also have an environmental change or a legislative change that needs to be addressed, and we'll time that into the budget. So each department presents a pre-submission to a corporate team. That corporate team typically involves finance, operations, and IT. From finance, I would be there, as well as the budget contact. And I'll just tell you about the structure that we have on budget, which is very unusual for municipalities. Most municipalities separate everything. They separate capital budget, and they have a different person who does operating budget, and never the two shall meet. A number of years ago, we created the finance frontier, and we created budget contacts that do both. So the budget contact that works with operations will work with, whether it's operating or capital, it doesn't matter, that it's one person, it's one contact. And we found that to be very, very useful. So the budget contact will be always in this meeting as well. Operation, who is the #1 contributor and completer of capital projects, are represented by the director, and often we'll have building maintenance there as well, and sometimes fleet, depending on the department. And IT is there in case we need to consider any technology issues around the particular projects. So once the discussion is had, we may shift some projects. We may say no, or have other information that maybe changes that pre-submission. It gets costed, and then it comes back to the team again in August for a review. This is the point where council list is also looked at through the summer, and then they'll come, the items moving forward will come forward as fully costed and investigated as part of the council list. So in early September, senior management will review all the capital submission in the council list and provide directions to the departments for the inclusion in the capital budget and long-range capital forecast. And then that's when we start creating all the budget submissions. All the departments start creating them. So this is what we call the detail sheet. So each project has its own detail sheet. That includes the description of the project and what the scope is, the timing, and also the cost and the funding of it. And finance works together with the departments to make sure that the appropriate funding source is being used. You will see when you see the budget that we will sometimes group projects into one sheet. So that's usually in the long-range capital forecast, so not the current year. The last 4 years where we'll group them together because they're just continuing, like road resurfacing, we'll put more than 1 year on because it's the same thing, it's just different projects and we'll tell you what they are. At the same time that this is happening, finance is compiling the revenue forecast and calculating the spending caps and cash flows that can be used to fund all these capital projects that are coming in. Spending caps. Probably one of my favorite topics. So when we created the FSP, we created a situation where our active capital reserves have a 65% spending cap. So what that means is that of all the money that's coming in from the different sources, which is slots, general levy, and Viridian, only 65% of that is eligible to be spent in a given year on capital projects. And we do that on all the reserves except for the debt reduction reserve. So we recognize that it's not a hard and fast rule. It could be 63, it could be 67, somewhere in there. We're not too worried about it. One of the things that we didn't really contemplate when we created the FSP is those really singular large projects. So where we have a roof and it's $1 million and the spending cap $600,000, it's never going to fit. So we have, in the last few years, we've had a few of those large building maintenance, I think, has pretty much been the one that has hit the caps. And we have said, okay, we're not going to count that in the cap, and we'll let the cap stand by itself on all the other projects, and we won't count that one. And that's part of why we have to grow the reserves. And we're going to talk about growing the reserves, but that's a perfect example of where you have that additional 35% that's not spent that you can use to fund a project like that. Like right now, the ACC ice pads replacement slabs is going to be like $1.4 million. I could never fund that in a funding cap. But that difference that I've maintained and the 35% lets me do that.
It's 1.2 million per pad?
Oh, no, there's a report coming on that one, right, Captain?
It's on Monday.
Yeah, it's on Monday. Yeah, it's already posted. It's a slab replacement.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it per pad?
Is it per pad?
No, that's the total. It's not per pad, it's the
Yeah.
total, 1.4.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I probably should
Read it
use a
again.
different example. So.
Yeah, I hear these numbers.
That's the total cost of the project.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a few other things being done on that.
Yes.
Slab.
Some seven more.
Yes. So the spending caps, we're going to go and we'll be re-reviewing it and addressing it when we complete the asset management plan. Okay? The asset management plan is going to drive a lot of changes to how we're using our reserves and the FSP, for sure. So the principles of the spending caps are to provide staff with funding guidelines as we develop the budget, to ensure the growth reserves year over year, and to allow for the fiscal responsible response to emergency situation, grant opportunities, or other unanticipated events. So why is the growth of the reserves important? So there's a number of reasons. I think that kind of the most important ones are to fund over budget or unbudgeted projects as they may occur. For the single dollar larger infrastructure projects that we just talked about, And I think one of the most important, frankly, is to provide some protection against the revenue uncertainties. So what happens is if we have a situation like the slots reduced by 50%, oh, it happened, then we're already protected on it because we've been collecting a bit more money and holding that money to the side and letting the reserve grow. So we have some protection. Is it forever? No, but it certainly smooths out a big impact of a non-tax revenue source. It also recognizes that most of our infrastructure, like we were just talking about on the stormwater ponds, haven't hit their big maintenance cycles that they need a lot of replacement. So that building of reserves gives us that added capacity when we're hitting those, start hitting those, and which will be looked at through the asset management and will help us with our funding and the planned maintenance for our facilities and infrastructure. So just a reminder, I know I say it every time, but we know asset management plan is going to show a substantial deficit in funding. This is going to happen to every single municipality. It's just, it is. So it'll be then, how do we manage that? So we will end up with some unfunded works once this all comes into place. And we'll just have to wait till the asset management plan. Well, we'll be working with operations and finance are working closely, and we'll be looking at that funding and reporting back to council on that. But this is something that everybody's expecting. And some who are already a little bit ahead of the game have already identified the shortfalls in funding that occur with the completion of the asset management plan. So carrying on in the timetable, come in November, senior management has kind of that final review where we look at not only the projects, but all the funding as well. We try to, keep ourselves as close as possible to the spending cap guidelines and, make sure that we're consistent with the external projects that we talked about before. So the idea being that by the time that the capital budget's published, is that it's balanced, we're good with the timing of the projects as well as the funding of the projects. Now, there is a process for pre-budget, so this will sometimes happen where budget is being contemplated. So for instance, something contemplated in 2019 that needs earlier approval than February 4th, and that might happen because of it's usually timing issues. So it may be that the facility needs to shut down for the work, so we want to shut it down at the most appropriate time. It may be that, a good example actually is vehicles. So there's a cycle that the industry works on. So you have to order them by a certain time or else you're not getting it till the next cycle of production of vehicles. And it may also be because there's a change in the region's plans and they do something earlier in this case if it's a pre-budget. Pre-budget approvals have to come before GGC. They're all done by report. And it's important to remember these ones because these are ones that if a project has pre-budget approval, it can't be changed once capital budget comes in front of council and comes to the public meeting. So then the presentation. So this is what we produce and provide to council and the public. So we do a capital report each year that I write, and it supports for the approval of the capital budget. And at the same time we do the capital budget and long-range capital forecast presentation and approvals, we also approve the general levy reserve allocations. We have within the FSP a condition that says that you can't change the general levy reserve allocations after capital budget's approved. And so remembering that the general levy reserve allocations come from the operating budget, we do the operating budget after capital, so you can't change them when you approve operating, because we've already approved capital and used them. So that's the timing.
Sneaky.
It's not, it's smart.
Caught me one year, sneaky.
Yeah.
Can you remind me, road common, is that under operations or under capital?
Traffic calming, it's under capital.
under capital.
Yeah.
Good to note.
Yeah, 5,950. Right?
Okay.
No,
Whatever.
not funding road watch.
That's how much they get from the
No,
town.
I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about road calming.
Oh, actually,
Road-
not the-
actual
not the
road
committee.
calming,
Gotcha.
That it's under capital
Not a
budget,
grant for the committee.
not under operations.
Correct.
Somehow I always get that mixed up.
Right.
I think, because sometimes we do painting on bike lanes,
Yes.
probably in operating, so
It
The
could be that.
repainting of all those lines falls under the operating budget within operation, but for any new infrastructure that we would put in, it would fall under capital, under operations,
Like traffic calming, as you're talking.
like traffic.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
stop sign.
So each budget has a project listing. The project listing shows the name of the project, the category type, the cost, and the year of funding. The projects are presented by categories. So we use this type of categories. We changed this a few years ago. So we use this type of category so that you have similar projects grouped together. So you can see, for instance, if you're looking in parks and open spaces, you can see all the parks together over the 5 years and when they're happening. So it kind of makes, instead of trying to look everywhere and do it by department, you can see it by the actual type. And speaking, we actually use types. We further break things down into studies, new, rehabilitation, replacement, and maintenance. And we have definitions of each of those ones. Rehabilitation usually is a design component. It's a bit more extensive. Replacement is a one-for-one, and maintenance is not rehabilitation. And it's just the maintenance needed to maintain the expected life of the asset. Capital detail sheets, so there's this, we talked about this briefly. So each of those detail sheets contains important information, including the department or section who has put it forward, the project name, when it's starting, the scope and rationale, description. We'll reference the plans and studies if there's a particular one, like the DC study or a master plan, the total cost, and how we're funding it.
So within these notes would be planned roads to be calmed, is that right? So would it be in there?
Yep,
The
yep,
list
so we
of
have
and the
a,
year that it's gonna happen in, and
Exactly.
the cost is gonna be, and blah, 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 blah.
yep.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So we do an alternate to the project list, which we do it as a financing summary. So now you can also look and say, okay, my funding for federal gas tax, here's all the projects that are funded by that source of funding. And we do that for each of the funding sources. So whether it be a reserve fund, each of them have a list of the projects that are being funded by that source. The continuities, this is kind of the last piece of the puzzle on the budget book, which shows you the opening balances for the reserves and reserve funds, the contributions in year for each of the years, so it's a 5-year, and as well as the withdrawals. So the contributions will be from development, so that's mostly DCs, development charges, as well as general levy slots and Viridian, federal gas tax, and interest on those, on each of the reserves. The withdrawals are, of course, capital funding and a very small transfer to debt repayment reserve. Council approval. So the public meeting is posted on the town's website and advertised for 4 weeks prior to the meeting. We published the capital budget and long-range capital forecast on the website a week prior to the public meeting. And the public meeting agenda includes opening comments from the chair, presentation by myself. The public has 2 opportunities to comment or ask questions, both at the opening of the meeting and the closing of the meeting. In the middle, we do the debate and questions by council, and at the end, there is a budget recommendation. The following council meeting, there'll be a ratification of the budget, and that will include any amendments changed would be ratified at that time. And the day after that, we are starting capital projects. So this is a part that probably has really never been shared with council, and it's kind of how we deliver our capital plan. Other than the capital expenditure policy, there's a lot of work that is done through the departments to get moved from the paper plan onto actually getting all the work done. So the capital expenditure policy is a policy that's approved by council, and it ensures that approvals are done and done appropriately, funding sources are identified, and again, are appropriate. So it details the responsibility, reporting, and funding for contracts. It tells us how to deal with over budget projects, either whether that's before or after the award, as well as unbudgeted and emergencies. You will be getting an updated expenditure policy, probably, well, definitely one in 2019. So I thought it was easier than try to go through everybody's jobs, is what is council's responsibilities under this. So if it's under these limits, it's staff's responsibility. So council awards all capital projects over $250,000. All unbudgeted capital projects over $75,000. And projects projected to be over budget of $75,000. And as well, if there's any material change in what had been presented in the capital budget, that project contract award will also come to GGC as well for approval. So there's some reporting that we do to council that council sees on capital. So we do the capital account closings. We usually do 2 a year. So those indicate the projects on project by project basis, the final balances of any that have been completed or canceled. And if there's additional funding needed, that would be approved at that time. We isolate the ones that council's already seen. So we always show the ones that council awarded versus the ones that staff have awarded. There is also, we have a policy of where we started with the project that got awarded at General Government Committee. Any awards reports must go back to General Government Committee again. It can't have one award at General Government Committee and then have staff awards after that. It's once it starts at General Government Committee, it stays at General Government Committee for any future reporting.
On the slide before, you mentioned that there's a possibility that projects get completed or canceled.
Yep.
Do we typically have a lot of projects that we don't see through?
They usually get canceled because the funding's needed to produce some other project. So one of the things that staff have to do is if they have an over budget, they need to look and see if there is a project that has similar funding that they can cancel and defer to another year to help fund that the over budget.
Great, thank you.
And occasionally they get canceled because of timing, like the region changes their budget is one, or it turns out that it's a much bigger project. When we started investigating, we went, oh, nope, that's not going to be sufficient. We need to look into it a little bit more.
Like clicker hooks. The bane of your existence. Keep bringing that one out.
So unbudgeted and emergency purchases. So unbudgeted, and these aren't dirty words just to say. People think they are, but they're not.
That's
okay?
what you say.
I don't think they're dirty words. So unbudgeted is that, stuff happens every single day. Budgets are as good as the day they're passed and something changes after that.
Yeah.
They can also be a result of grant opportunities, and they may be not an emergency, but they also may not be able to wait till the next budget cycle. We will report those as part of the capital closing report. If it's over $75,000, it's coming to council anyways. From a emergency, we created a policy to allow staff the ability to react and take the necessary steps to deal with emergencies, and the reporting comes second. So that's reviewed carefully by staff. If necessary, we'll bring it back to council. Pressures. So we talked about a lot of these on Monday, so good time to ask questions if there's something that you didn't get on Monday on these ones. So, we've talked about the slots revenue. We know that reduction is coming. You can see now the importance of slots when it's associated with reserves and funding for capital. We'll have to wait to see what the timing is exactly of the reduction of the slots and what the impact will be once Durham Live is up and running to the attendance at the slots in Ajax. So one of the things we want to make sure is if we're using funding in the slots into operating budget, is it sustainable? Are we able to maintain that? Do we need to move it to the tax base? We need to look at changing the reserve allocation structure. And we do know that with reduction in slots, there'll be less money in debt reduction, which means there'll be less money for phase 3 of Ardley Rec Center. I talked about the 1% capital tax levy that most municipalities use. That will need to be a revisit for the town, depending on the lowering of the slots and how we manage the less money coming in. And it could result in a reduction or deferral of capital projects as well. Will it be, we like to call it kind of a soft landing, because the slots all go into reserves and not into the tax base. We have time to adjust as we figure out what the value and the changes are of the revenue. We did assume in the upcoming forecast that a reduction of 50% of the slots in 2021. Cost of construction, we had some conversations about this on Monday as well. We know we're seeing the increasing cost of construction in a number of ways. We're seeing it when tender documents are being issued and they're coming back, and they're all kind of roughly the same price but higher than expected. We saw it as we finished the development charge background study. We had a lot of significant increases. And as I mentioned before, the demands alone just with the region and the 407 construction has created a higher demand and hence higher costs of constructions. And of course, it follows that the spending caps become harder to hit when the construction costs are coming out. Asset management, I think we've talked about this one sufficiently. I think at the end of the day, it's good. It'll be good legislation. I think it will inform our plan well. I think it's just going to be, it's hard to implement. There's a lot of pieces to it. And, municipalities like ours and many municipalities are 50 years old and trying to categorize and cost and figure out the plan. We have a lot of assets. So it's a lot of work, but in the end, I think it will be a good thing. We will, as a requirement of the legislation, have to move the capital plan from a 5-year to a 10-year. Which I also think is good, but I'm not sure we can fund a 10-year. So the pressures on the reserves, we've talked about the lower slots revenue, declining assessment growth, which is to be expected as you move to build out. The need that we've had on exceeding spending caps, that's, I think we talked that one to death as well. Operating budget surplus. So there's a report coming on Monday on the expected or estimated operating budget surplus. It is fairly low, the estimate at this point, so it's not able to in turn support reserves. You'll recall that the sole funding source for the capital contingency reserve is operating budget surplus, and that is the reserve that helps us pay for our share of grants. So it's an important reserve. We have been looking at and will be doing some reserve allocations to the operating budget, and the principle of that is to mitigate tax rate increases. But we're only using them where it's a one-off, that it's not a year-over-year cost, because sooner or later you'd have to pay for it. If you can do one-offs, you can do it. You can use reserves in that way. And of course, asset management is going to create pressures as well. The good news is we have an expectation of higher dividends with the Viridian merger that has been approved, but it will take a little while for it to get put in place, and we'll incorporate the Viridian merger, the higher dividends in next year's capital budget. The reserves, have a number of impacts. This is maybe kind of, like, it sounds obvious, but interesting kind of writing them down. So we have the increase side where we're not spending up to the spending cap, and that actually does happen. Where we have under budgets, where we have higher slots of Meridian revenue, where the retired debt, it creates an increase in allocation. There's interest on them as well. And then operating budget surplus, where it can fund, it will increase the value of reserves. Decreases are pretty much the opposite of all of those, including unbudgeted and emergencies. So we did a kind of look at what is the status of our reserves from the start of the 2014 implementation of the financial sustainability plan. So I looked at the balances the estimated balances as of December 31st, 2018, and I said, okay, so if I had, using 2015 as a base year, and if I had kept 35%, remember the spending cap's 65, if I had kept 35%, I said that was acceptable, or performed as expected. So roads maintenance and general infrastructure have been able to maintain the amount above the spending cap. That's good news. The underperforming are the building maintenance and development reserve. Building maintenance has actually decreased from 2014. And a lot of that is those big costs associated with the roof replacements or big maintenance costs on those ones. Development reserve has been had to fund the town's portion of DCs, and we know the cost of those projects have been going up quite a bit. It also has funded some of the, what we call the parachuted in. So ones that get identified and are not really, they're new. They would include something like a splash pad. I think Corn Park splash pad was
One thing I got a yes on.
One thing you got to
In 8 years, the one
Paradise
thing.
Park, we'll use the development reserve on that one. I can't think of any else off the top, but those are the type of things where they, add to the community. They probably would have been DCs, but they're not part of the DCs, but they develop the community. And then beyond expectations are the strategic initiatives reserve and the vehicle and equipment replacement reserve. So strategic initiatives is beyond, mostly because we haven't been reaching and using the cap, but don't worry, we look after that in 2019. So we will be using up quite a bit, safely, but quite a bit of the strategic initiatives reserve then.
How?
By master plans, primarily through master plans, various master plans that have been identified.
Core services review, agriculture master plan, all those things that we talked about.
IT strategy, all those. The vehicle and equipment replacement. There's a reason, this one is the highest funded reserve of all of them from the slots and general levy and Meridian. And the reason is that it always was reserved that we could never keep enough money in. And when we created the FSP, it had that high level of funding. So it's done well. The thing that we don't have is that future out large replacements of some of the fire trucks, which can easily be over $1 million by themselves on a replacement. So again, asset management is going to help us in that longer range thinking on that one. But good news, bad news. At least some of them did well. That's good. Development charges. So as you may or may not be aware, our most recent DC bylaw was passed on July 2018. There was a substantial increase in the charge, and it is under appeal. So we will have to wait to see how that appeal is going. I think our first should be in the spring. We'll be going to address that appeal, and we'll let you know what happens. The DC Reserve Fund is being stretched a little bit. So we are looking at solutions on how to do some temporary borrowing, and I just got off the phone with the region today, and we've talked, because the region has to approve borrowing for a lower tier municipality. We have a solution that we've used before where we do a promissory note, and governed under the Municipal Act and does not need region approval. So we'll probably look to put something in place so that we have the ability to react if the DC Reserve Fund gets into an overdrawn position. And we'll use some funding from existing reserves, probably the post-growth reserve, to cover that for the next year or two. It is expected to recover starting in 2021. Capital contingency. So to your question, Marilyn, this year, in 2018, we've used 1.7 million out of the 2.5 million. And we've used that for grants for 475,000 and 1.3 of unbudgeted or emergency. It's been a bit of an unusual year for that. The target balance is 2.5 million. We will not be able to get that back up this year, but we'll continue in future years on any surplus, is applying that back to get that capital contingency reserve to where it needs to be. And like I said, we do find that the grants run in cycles, so I don't expect that they tend to run in election years. So that's when you'll see the push of them, which is why we saw a bunch last year.
I'm sorry if I missed this, but what
Yeah.
was the unbudgeted emergency?
1.2. I actually don't have a list of them.
Oh, so there was more than just.
Oh, yeah,
there was just one-
there's a bunch of small ones. There was, well, I know one was the Durham region, the bus pads. When they put the bus pads in, we did the connections, so the trails connected to the bus pads, so we did that as an unbudgeted. A lot of these have come to council.
I'm sure they have.
Sorry, I didn't bring the list of them with me.
If you could, do you mind just emailing them?
No,
Just
no,
so
no.
we all have it?
Yep,
I know we approved it, I just don't remember what's
Yeah.
in it. Yeah.
yep, no problem at all. Okay, so that's the nuts and bolts, the A to Z of the capital budget. So now do you have any questions from that before we go further? Because that's all about how we get from start to finish on that one. And I know I find it pretty exciting. I'm not sure about anybody else.
Look at her eyes light up.
I really enjoy it. It was actually kind of fun making this, even though it was like 67 pages.
Flew by.
Blue wire? Thanks.
It's a party compared to yesterday.
Ready?
It's tough to do.
We had a long regional meeting. They don't understand.
8 hours of waste
Okay.
on waste.
Stop saying that.
So
Okay. Yeah.
so the 2/3, 1/3, if I'm understanding, is the basic formula that you use for spending.
Yep. So
That was
that's,
reserve 1/3.
yeah, so we take the annual revenues and we'll spend 65% on capital projects and we'll hold 35%.
Right. And operations being completely different now.
Yep. Okay. So these are kind of just some of the highlights that, that you're going to see in the capital budget. So kind of the looking forward, which is about some of the strategies and plans. So we've talked about the IT strategy, the asset management plan is a big one for 2019, as well as the economic development strategy, the recreation master plan, and the fire master plan. In transportation, we're going to be continuing the LED streetlight conversion, as well as working up on Roslyn Road and Church Street, north of Roslyn. For the community, the opening of Audley Rec Center Phase 2 will be happening in the fall. The Paradise Park washroom and park improvements are included in the budget for 19. As well, we have cricket clubhouse and field improvements and new neighborhood park and parkettes in Mulberry Meadows. And this is kind of, not quite as big as I would have liked it. So this kind of gives you an idea of where all the funding sources come. So on the left is the 19 budget only. On the right is the 5-year capital plan. So generally, development charges and funding, 25 to 26% of our capital budget. Our biggest contributor, of course, is our reserves. And federal gas tax gives us quite a bit of money too. So for the public meeting, so on February 11th, the budget's going to be coming forward to council, part of the meeting. We talked about the formatted already. So following this meeting, and probably any minute now, it's going to be posted on the town's website. So you'll have the project list, the detail sheets, and everything associated with the budget and the long-range forecast. We have provided this earlier than usual. Usually we would have provided it a week before the meeting, but I think we're at least a couple of weeks early. I think it's nice to have a little extra time in the first year of council term to have a look at that one. If you have any questions or any comments, you can talk to senior management at any time. And also we have a dedicated finance@ajax.ca that anyone can use, public or counselors, or always available to have a chat if you want to talk about anything. So on February 5th, we'll post the agenda as well as my report will be posted at that time as well. So you remember I talked about the pre-budget approvals. So because of election year, we actually have had a few more pre-budget approvals than we normally would. So these ones are all projects that can't be removed from the 2019 capital budget. For instance, road resurfacing, one of the big reasons for doing that is to get it out early on the street. And most of the other ones are all associated with timing, whether it is for services or for legislation.
Sorry, what's road connection replacement under vehicle equipment replacement?
Yes, Nicole, be happy to answer that one.
So that's the software that our help desk uses to remote into other people's computers in order to help them resolve issues. And our other one surprisingly came to end of life, and we couldn't use it to support Windows 10. So it was we just couldn't wait until the new year to replace it.
Thank you.
So just talking about processes now. So you're going to get a budget that's balanced and will work with the reserve funding and so forth. And when you're thinking about amendments that maybe want to be considered on capital budget, we need to think about and consider spending caps. So one of a guide that can be used is if you have a change in projects, you might look to something that has similar funding, similar costs that can be switched. So a good example of that is something like a playground. So where we maybe have, you would like to see playground switched in year order. That's an easy switch if council will approve that, if that's an amendment you're looking at. So looking at funding is always a good idea. We can do some changes and agree to some of these changes right on the floor. One like that would be easy, a small ad that we can accommodate. We usually, kind of quickly have that decision on the floor. But if there are significant changes to the plan that's being published today, we're going to have those referred back to staff. We're going to have a look at it because a lot of times if there's a significant change, we have to do more research than we can do at that moment in time, and we'll come back with an appropriate amendment when we consider what our staff resources are, and the funding impacts are, and whether there's any associated studies or additional work that may be able to be done. So there's a few ways that we can deal with a project that is being added. In particular, is that we can find a way to include it in the 2019 budget. We could include it in a later year, so it may be something that we'll say that we'll put into 2020 or beyond. It could be that it needs further review, that we don't have the time to give it the due diligence that it needs, particularly if there's a region impact or something like that, and we will report back at a later date during the year. We could do an unbudgeted in year, so that's how we could manage that one. So if we didn't have the time to do the investigation, but we went and did it, when it was done, council could approve an unbudgeted in the year, and we could get it done that way. And then we can also defer it, and the idea of the project can be moved into the next year's budget consideration, kind of like an early council list. So those are all the different ways that we may come back and say, okay, here's the project you talked about, this was council was interested in, and this is the way we can manage it. And then we will come back at the February 25th meeting, which is the council meeting following the budget, and we will ratify the budget at that time. And I'm done. 77 slides in total.
Sorry, my last question is, you find this fun? Is the way you use
Oh, okay, capital budget's my favorite.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. It's my absolute favorite.
No judging.
I'm judging a little bit, not gonna lie.
Oh, you know what, I'm happy to be judged on it, but you know what? I'm a great person to talk about it
Yeah.
because I like to. So, if you
Sheila?
have, yeah,
What's the proposed use of ARC Phase 3?
phase 3 would be additional ice pads. One, I think, right? One additional ice pad?
There's
There's a
the
couple of
consideration
scenarios.
right now around, and Tracy and I talk about this often around, right now, in the planning stages, we have two pads. But in further consideration around our demographic, is it 2 ice pads? Is it an ice pad and another indoor has the ability to transform into an indoor soccer? That's something else we're considering as well. So there's a couple of options. And then Tracy continues to monitor feedback from residents in regards to kind of the needs of the community.
So I'll take 2 pieces, so our
Sorry?
quarterly, I'll take 2 pieces, so our quarterly customer feedback, which, you know, we get copious amounts of feedback, so I track that, monitor it, and use that for my plans. We also have our rec master plan, so what will we hear in that process in terms of what those projected needs are, demographic shifts, and that will really help us to make informed decisions as we approach the idea of our phase 3.
Considering the demographic, any future plans for a cricket field at all?
That is something that we have put forward as things that we're thinking about and talking about, so it's definitely in the mix. So, absolutely.
Because I'm in a meeting next Sunday with the Ajax Cricket Club, and it was like they're proposed to move, I think, up north.
So, just,
What is happening with the current location?
so, over the past year, staff have had ongoing dialogue with the Ajax Cricket Club. We brought a report to council in the spring of last year that is basically going to transition the Ajax Cricket Club from its current long-standing relationship where they operated it to become a town facility. It is a town facility, but the town will maintain control of it again in partnership with Ajax Cricket Club. So we've had these ongoing discussions with the club itself in terms of making investments to improve not only the field value, but the clubhouse as well. So you'll start to see money in the capital program for 2019 with the expectation that the town will retain control of that facility in September of 2019. We've got a capital
The lease is up then, correct?
It's about a year early, but because the cricket club themselves approached the town based on their inability to continue to maintain their loss of volunteers and so forth, we entered into sort of a partnership arrangement to have the agreement lapse 1 year in advance so that we could start to make those investments. So that was part one. We've also met with, there's neighborhood-based or community-based cricket organizations in addition to the Ajax Cricket Club that have expressed interest in cricket infrastructure in Ajax. I do expect it to be a key component that we'll be looking at through the Recreation Master Plan. We've heard it repeatedly throughout the community, so it's not necessarily a new full cricket pitch similar to what we have in Ajax as far as the cricket club facility itself goes, but what type of infrastructure can we put in place in our existing parks and our new parks? Some of it's not necessarily full field, some of it's more youth-based. There can be temporary wickets that are put in place, but it's similar to what we have with baseball and soccer, where if a family wishes to just take, if a father and child or daughter wish to take their family and friends to a neighborhood park, that they've got the ability to participate and play cricket just like you do other sports. So we've had those conversations. We know there's a need and a demand to introduce them into our local neighborhood parks. We expect to do that and define it more clearly through the Recreation Master Plan, but we're not necessarily waiting for that. We're doing that in advance and knowing that there is a need. With respect to ARC, we have looked at and will be looking to introduce cricket facilities, whether it's a full field. I can't speak to that at this point in time, but definitely cricket infrastructure. We would be looking to incorporate whether it's a wicket that people could take batting practice, they could go and play informally. We will be looking at that. clubs that are currently using the recreation center and the gymnasium for indoor cricket, and it is limited to a fairly significant extent already at the Audi Recreation Center.
You just memorize all that? That's like an encyclopedia of cricket, man. Amazing. But that one is very well maintained by the town, right? It's maintained by the town? Yeah, it's in really, really good shape. So you're gonna keep that open?
We're going to make
Joint-
investments
joint.
and improve the existing cricket club.
Thank you so much.
Just quickly, I know this is not on sports fields, but in Ward 1, we're at end of life beyond with Village Arena. And obviously, we're going to have to replace that pad to keep up with in the future. I guess that's why whenever we saw pads coming in for Phase 3 at ARC, we thought that would possibly be a solution on the other side. Just
So with the Rec and Culture Master Plan, it does contemplate what the future of the village will be in terms of
Yeah.
retaining what assets exist there, what programming and services exist there, what's going to come down the pipe. What are our ice utilization rates at that, going into the future as well? What makes the most sense for our community as we sort of move forward? So we'll absolutely look at the village. We know there's things we need to retain. Will they be at the village or somewhere else? We don't know that. And we're going to look at that from a really, broad perspective. But it will give us a lot of information around buildings, infrastructure, programs, services, and then that will then inform future capital plans, future operating budgets.
yeah.
When is that? Sorry.
It's for 19.
For 19.
Yeah.
And we didn't want to compromise anything with cricket.
No, I don't play cricket.
Don't worry.
I'm too fat.
So that's the recreation master plan. Is the village handled outside of that? The village dream or whatever? Like, is it a master plan or, okay, what did they
Are you
call
talking
it?
about a potential community center?
No, I'm talking about looking at everything, the library,
Forecast?
the arena, the whole block there.
That's what we're talking about.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh,
like
okay.
Redeveloping something, some
Yeah.
Looking
community.
at
Right.
that
building.
existing campus that sits there, for the most part, excluding library branch, is really recreation, programming, services, and
Yeah.
infrastructure. So
Yeah.
looking at that piece from a sort of an overarching perspective and what is that future
So
proposed?
that's all handled inside of your recreation plan. It won't be outside of that.
In terms of the recreation aspects of the village.
Okay, but not the whole dream of the village.
it
Sorry,
wouldn't
I'm,
plan.
am I asking something that I shouldn't be asking?
No, not at all, not at all.
Okay.
So what we've incorporated within the terms of reference for the recreation master plan is looking at that municipal complex, that block, which includes the library, the seniors, and the arena, so that
Yeah.
entire block. And what the recreation master plan will look at is the planned or intended uses that could be accommodated on that site, but we've also made provisions to actually do a block planning exercise, so that once we understand the uses, that we could look at options in terms of how the site could physically be developed, in terms of the amount of space and the building form, whether it's one-story, multi-stories, the relationship with parking, and how that could work. And there'll be options that will be presented that would accommodate those uses. So that is captured within the recreation master plan in terms of reference. So we will be able to consult and deal with, sort of at a conceptual level, how we envision that block looking longer term.
Okay, I'm very excited to see what that will look like.
And the
I
5
think that-
residential homes that are there on Sherwood that encompass that block. Anyway,
Yeah, but the one thing that I know that we need to address in the village is parking, so hopefully that's included in all of that. That's where I was kind of going with, and I can't wait to see it.
By that, do you mean parking amenities related to the recreation
Yes,
facilities?
yes.
Okay.
and the village.
And through the village.
Yeah,
but-
we wouldn't be looking at
No,
business
I know
parking.
that.
Okay.
No, I know that, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, recreation, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then going back to the council roundtable lists that
Yep.
were presented on Monday. So some of those items might have already been in the plans.
Correct.
So then 2019, we might see some of those things come to fruition.
Yes.
Is it, and then the rest of the list,
Yep.
is there's no room left in 2019 for those things? Or, like, unless it's like one of those unbudgeted things, we can piggyback with something else.
Yeah, so,
Most of the roundtables would be 2020 and forward?
well, it kind of depends what they are, because they may not only be capital, they may be other things as
Okay,
well, right?
yeah.
So there'll be some that require some time, so we have to have a plan. Like, we're not going to do everything on the roundtable list in 2019 regardless. It'll be over the term of the council, right? You know, and that's part of doing the strategic plan and what does it look like
Right.
and making the planning. So, and that's where, you know, if there are things that need to be done in 19 through council, that we come back with the amendment to the budget as needed, and we'll give you our thoughts on where it needs to be done. So it may be that we put it in 19, it may be that we need to do further studies, maybe that we could do it in year unbudgeted, maybe that it needs to be deferred out. So it kind of depends what it is
Yeah.
on how we manage it. So,
Thank you.
Anyone else?
This is very, I'm
I'm
done.
done.
Thank you very much. This was very
I thank you
They
for
have a
your
watch.
patience.
When will we, sorry, you said
You're not gonna
that
put
that
that.
the notice is going out, but when will we actually get a, complete list of capital projects?
I'm hoping it's on the website right now.
I looked. Is it?
Okay, it'll be there by tonight.
Well, it just came up then. so,
Just came up, there
okay.
you go. Perfectly timed.
Is there anything else? We got till like 4:30, guys.
No, we have a walking tour
You
we
want me to go
gotta
over
do.
it again? I can start over.
No. We gotta do a walking
She
tour.
is.
Pick your favorite chapter. Yeah.
No, all good?
No, thank you very much. It was fantastic.
Yeah,
Okay, it's a lot.
I don't have
It
the
is a lot.
agenda in front of me, so I don't know if we have it. All good?
No, nothing.
Why are we still taking these? Do we not?
Oh, you know those 4 inactive?
As part of the
So,
past
To
council
read the speakers list
that
on.
needed
Is there
If nobody
option
objects,
that
we can
just-
stop.
We would use them again, or you
So
got rid of
they're
them?
We
they're
already
inactive
paperless
that they don't
municipal.
finance capital on a
Say
regular
no more.
basis.
Okay.
So one's capital contingency, which we use for unbudgeted and for grants. So it's active in the sense
Singing
that
the
it's
same
funding
thing.
projects.
Okay.
Just not in the budget process, in the capital budget process.
All right.
I'm trying to think of the other ones. There's post-growth,
Yeah.
which is going to be subject to a review on use for the financial sustainability plan. It will also likely be used for temporary borrowing to support the development charge reserve fund over the next 2 years.
So they're not just dormant accounts that are just sitting there? like
Yeah,
that?
no,
Are no
they have
longer
plans.
needed. Okay.
They have plans, they're not used as an active source in the capital budget funding.
Sterling has a motion, but just for a side, I just have one thing I want to announce. Sorry I was late. I was at the Viridian unveiling event for the new brand. Everybody, I think, is aware that Viridian and Whitby Hydro have merged. Basically, the merger has been approved. It will be in effect, I believe, April 1st. And the
The new name?
unveiling was today. The new name is Alexicon. You will see a post from me on the site. I found out about it last week at a meeting. It's the new logo, everything else is all available. There will be a post on it today from me, so just everybody's aware. And it's very exciting.
Did they
Michael.
explain why they chose that name?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sounds like a
the
Or
branding
Alexa,
company,
the word.
Cinnamon Toast, is the name of the branding company.
Did you find out why they were named
It's a
that?
combination of, lexicon is electricity, and lexicon means,
Like words and verbs.
yeah, so they put it together.
It's the name of my niece, by the
And
way.
it's gonna be a lexicon
Cinnamon?
energy, so, which encompasses a lot more things, because I see the corporation going forward with a lot more non-regulatory items as well. A lot of more non-reg business outside of just electricity, so.
Any news on staffing? Will Michael Angelmere still be?
We don't know that, but what I'm told is every single person from Whitby and Viridian that wants to stay has been placed and will stay. So through attrition, some will leave, but everybody that wants to stay has a job. There's no layoffs, there's no nothing.
But there's a head of Whitby, there's a head of.
Yeah, well, there's gonna be 2 boards as well, right? There's
Oh,
right now there's this Viridian Corp and there's Viridian connections. Those are the two. One is the operating and one is the holding company. So, again, there'll be two CAOs for the new company.
Oh,
So John may stay and Michael might stay, I don't know. I'm not part of that, the board's not part of that.
Yeah, yeah.
so-
Don't know yet.
interesting.
So I
Well,
just
excellent.
wanted to announce that. And, okay, so we have a motion moved by
Motion to adjourn?
Councillor Lee.
Second.
I don't think we need second at GGC, do we? No. Those in favor? None opposed? Good meeting.
Thank you.